Hello humans and other species. I'm Batsy, and today we are going to have a look at various bone meal farms. It all started some weeks ago when I made this farm. The idea was to get a passive income of food, even when I'm offline. Of course, I was a bit late to realize the most obvious thing. Crops don't really grow unless a player is there, even if the chunks are loaded. So looking around the tools that we have on the mod pack, I found out this thing called fertilizer. The Create mod already has a tree fertilizer, which has its own uses, but the Slice and Dice add-in gives a liquid version of the fertilizer that also works on grass and normal crops. Since the passive farm was a fail, my idea is to just force some crops to grow every time our food reserves are running low. Like having a bone meal crop farm, but this one is so much better looking. There are a few ways of crafting it, but I'm particularly interested in this recipe that uses the organic compost. It feels like a somewhat cheap recipe, but more importantly, we can automate all of these materials required to make the compost. And given the theme of the video, it's obvious to say that the first material I want to look into is the bone meal. It's hard to beat a good old moss farm when it comes to producing bone meal, but with so many mods in the server, surely there must be other ways of producing it in high amounts. The problem ends up being that there are tons and tons of recipes for composting. It's hard to tell which one of these items can be farmed easily, especially those that come from mods. But it also gives me hope to find something that can be used with the composters. All we really need is an easy-to-farm item that can keep producing when a player isn't online. And my intuition says that maybe Farmer's Delight could help us with that. They do introduce some farming mechanics. Some recipes are obvious to be a fail. Everything that has to do with crops is clearly a no-go. Not only they won't work with a player offline, they also tend to require a ton more bone meal or resources to grow than what's going to give us. That's kind of the deal why moss farms are good. Not only the composting percentage is quite high on those, they also yield several of them for every bone meal used. Tree bark, for example, could be interesting. This one comes from Farmer's Delight, and it can be both automated and mass-produced, even while offline, so we are certainly going to try this one out. These worms also look interesting. We can basically dig a block of dirt, and there is a chance to give a worm as extra loot. I say extra because unlike with gravel and flint, we are not going to lose the gravel once the flint drops instead. We can essentially use the same block of dirt indefinitely. And that's exactly what we are going to try out first. The idea is as simple as it gets. We want to dig out as much dirt as we can, as well as place all of said dirt back into the farm. The obvious solution is a minecart contraption because it will make the logistics incredibly easy. All that we require is a minecart with at least one barrel for storage. Then we add a row of drills to mine out all of the dirt, and a row of deployers to place it back in, with a big area where all of said dirt is going to go. This takes about a minute to set up in survival, and it 100% works while offline. Assuming that the chunk remains loaded by any mod or vanilla mechanic. Once we activate the rails, the contraption will move back and forth, digging out and placing down the same blocks of dirt, with a chance of getting some worms in the process. Those worms get extracted from the minecart with the portable unit, where they get thrown into a composter to get processed into bone meal. I did added a little bit of redstone to make sure that the dumping process is as quick as possible. Basically, the portable unit takes a while, even after it's done moving the items. But thankfully for us, we can send a redstone signal into the unit, and that will prevent or cut the connection with the cart. So all I'm doing here is detecting when an item goes through the chute. Then we send a single pulse forward, and we route it back through a delayed repeater. That breaks the connection after the cart had enough time to dump all of the worms. It feels rather unnecessary and over-engineered, but it barely takes a few seconds to dig through all of the dirt. If we had several more seconds to dump the items instead of maybe half a second, we could very well be costing the machine a lot more time to run one cycle. But the real question is this even worth it? Well, let's run it for maybe 10 minutes and find out how it does, shall we? Oh my goodness me. That's wow. Wowie wow. I tell you what. Let's check on the rest of the designs, and we will see all of the results together at the end. It should create a little bit more suspense. For this next design, I went straight into a normal Create farm. But before we check it out, there are a couple of caveats that we should talk about. It's obvious that any farm could be massively scaled up to produce tons of bone meal, so how are we ever going to compare one farm with the others? My thought is that just limiting the size should be good enough. All of these parcels are one chunk big, and for the most part, I'm trying to stick within it. Some stuff might stick out, or there might be plenty of spare space within the chunk, but that's fine. I'm just using it as a guideline to keep the farm somewhat similarly sized. Of course, I could still make a massive pillar of dirt within the chunk, all the way up to build limit, and it will probably outproduce any other farm. So like I said, just using it as a guideline and trying to keep them all similarly sized. The final results aren't going to be the best scientific research of the decade. I just want to have a feel of the farms and see what seems to be the best one for my needs. I might not even choose the one that produces the most, if the logistics or other factors fit my needs better. So leaving all of that aside, this next one is a cheaty one in a way. We are using the normal Create mechanics to process things from cobblestone all the way to bone meal, which means we need to generate cobblestone in the first place. Here's the thing. If you have a big factory around Create, you never really want to make a cobble generator for every single process you add to it. It's incredibly unnecessary. It's always a better idea to have a bigger and centralized cobble generator that feeds the factory. But I'm not really counting it for the size of the farm, given that the cobble gen is gonna be there for many other things anyway. In the same way, I'm not really counting the power generation of any of those farms either. Those are things we should already have in our factories anyway. I don't want to count them in. Like I said, this won't be a flawless scientific experiment. I just want to find what suits me best. I have a big power plant and a massive cobble gen, so I don't need to include those. Alrighty, that was quite the boring chit-chat. So what do we have going on? The first thing I added is a circuit to limit the cobble production to about half of what my current cobble generation can produce. I think that's a realistic amount of cobble for most cases. There is also a link to disable this portion altogether. The bottleneck is going to be the mixers anyway. They work rather slowly, so we don't want to saturate the washing section either. In the end, we won't be using that much cobblestone. I felt like it would be unfair to base this design on a completely oversized cobble gen. Even then, I still have the feeling that using Create might very well be the highest producing design we see today. But that's still yet to see. For now, we want to take all of that cobblestone and crush it down into gravel. We immediately take the gravel and crush it again to make sand. We are going to burn all of the excess materials, throwing them into the lava, while we haunt the sand to make it soul sand. Then we wash all of that soul sand to get the quartz. We also getting some extra gold nuggets, but we are going to burn those down too. The important part about it is to get said quartz. That's the main component to eventually get the bone meal. This next section is a bit more confusing to look at, but just because I build it in a weird way. Essentially, we want to take the quartz and combine it with a bunch of cobblestone to produce the diorite. We move the remaining quartz forward, and we combine that with the rest of the diorite. That will produce calcite. Now, if we grind down said calcite, we're going to get the bone meal we're looking for. Like I said, it's a bit harder to see in this setup. I was a silly bat and made some stuff backwards. But it works, and the results are obviously massive, even though we are only using 4 basins for each step. Which, like I said, it's a massive bottleneck. If we were to do this properly and actually consume all of the cobblestone that we are fictionally producing, this could very well be unmatched. But obviously, the size of it wouldn't be fair compared with the other farms that we have going on. And speaking of other farms, next we have one of my favorite things to make, a fishing farm. The idea is to use the recipe from Farmer's Delight to slice both cod and salmon with a knife. The resulting products are some fish slices and some nice bone meal. We also don't want to get any treasure, so that makes the fishing setup a whole lot easier to build. This is essentially what you need to automate fishing with Create. The deployer casts the fishing rod into the fenced pressure plate, which activates the repeater, and that holds the deployer in place. When it catches a fish, it releases the pressure plate, which allows the deployer to reel in and cast again. It's surprisingly simple to build, at least if you don't need treasures. We not only don't need treasure, we also rather not get any. The idea is to get as much fish as we can. Said fish should eventually reach the end of all of these hoppers to get dumped on this belt, where it gets processed with a knife to make bone meal. And of course the resulting fish just gets tossed into lava because we don't really need it. It has more details, like a tank to store all of the EXP we are getting. Then the fact that experience orbs glitch out upwards into a canal where they get gathered by a disenchanter. A particularly inspired system, if you ask me. And of course a loop to mend all of the fishing rods when they get below a certain damage level. But I have made too many videos about fishing farms. So what matters to us is that it produces quite a nice amount of bone meal. I should also loop the knife so that one also get repaired, but this should be enough for testing the rates anyway. That's not the only recipe added by Farmer's Delight, because we can also use chickens to get bone meal. So I obviously decided to try making a normal chicken farm. But then I multiplied it several times because it was going too slow. Spoiler alert, it's still way too slow. Not only this is destroying my FPS and my ears, it's also borderline useless. Unless you are desperate to have endless supply of food at the low price of your sanity. But because I'm super smart, I had a great idea. It also works with raw chicken, which we could gather with looting 3 for extra drops. So I designed an amazing system to separate the newborns from the grown chickens, but then I realized I basically multiplied the worst bone meal farm by 4 in the best case. And while I don't know a lot about math, I do know that 0 multiplied by 4 is still a big fat goose egg. So moving on from that terrible idea. This one I'm not sure if I'm going to include it, and I will explain why. There are 2 ideas at play here. The first is that you can almost sustain warp fungus generation. It only requires a little bit extra bone meal. The second one is that when you chop down a warp tree, you also get all of the wart leaf blocks. And those happen to be amazing to produce bone meal. My thought was to generate a ton of warped fungus, then have several spots to plant and harvest the trees. But then I realized I was producing way too much fungus. So I did a second test with a lot more trees and a smaller fungus farm. I also used toms for logistics because the amounts of items this thing moves is crazy and it bottlenecks at every corner. And if that wasn't enough problems, I keep having to add more and more composters to handle all of the wart leaves, and last time I checked, it was still not enough. But the worst problem of them all is the idea itself. You see those trees? We kinda don't care about the logs, just about the leaves. But they're overlapping so much, we are barely getting a decent amount of leaves for each one of them. The problem comes that the more trees that grow, the less efficient it becomes. At max capacity, it still produces more bone meal than it consumes, but we are essentially wasting half, if not a lot more, of what we could be getting by not spreading the trees around and fully getting all of its leaves. By my calculations, this fungus farm could probably sustain 4 or 5 times more trees. So if we add that to the fact that we really should spread the trees around, we reach a conundrum. Once done properly and set up efficiently, this could be the most insane and cool-looking bone meal farm. It just doesn't fit in the video and doesn't compare with the other farms at all. I could also reduce it down to a couple of trees instead, do it properly on a single chunk, and I bet it will still produce a really good amount of bone meal. But to me, it feels like wasting such a good farm on a much lesser version of itself. So, for now, and as a disappointment to some, I will move on to the last design instead, and if I see that I have plenty of time by the time I'm done editing, I might revisit this idea. If not, I will make a standalone video for it soon. But that leaves us with the last design for today, and this might very well be my favorite of the bunch. For sure, it has been the most enjoyable to work on. The idea here is that we still need to produce bark in order to make the organic compost. But the same bark can also be used to make bone meal too. So my thought was, why not combine both things and just be able to select what product we require. If we can decide the product output, it means that we can also set it up to change automatically when either of them runs low. So, with that in mind, how do we produce bark in the first place? It's honestly as simple as stripping out logs. Farmer's Delight makes it so we get bark as a side product during the process. The funny thing is that we have a data pack to be able to use the stone cutter for wood items too. That means that we do have a recipe to revert the log to its original state. And because it shares the same tags, that recipe affects the mechanical saw, so we can automate the process altogether. It's one of those silly interactions between several mods and data packs, where none of them considered one another, and we end up here with essentially an infinite loop. I'm usually always up for balancing things out, but to be honest, it just makes bone meal and paper. If someone wants to make 1,000,000 books, that's probably fine. But regardless, what matters to us now is how this thing works. I considered using a storage system to store the logs, and then having belts or things to move items between all of the parts. But that was just simply a mess and a half. So what we have here is a little loop instead. More annoying to set up, and you essentially need to add logs to each one manually. But once it's running, it just goes on its own. We are essentially reverting the logs into normal ones, and the inertia of the mechanical saw throws them into the depot. There they get stripped again, and we produce the bark. So the bark goes down into the composter to get processed, and the logs continue forward. After that, it moves up, and the cycle completes by landing on the saw again. Just having a 2 or 3 logs is enough to ensure it works as fast as it can, which is mostly determined by how fast the mechanical saw can go. I'm also running the belts underneath at only 16 RPM. That's to make sure that the composter takes priority over the funnel, so it always tries to produce bone meal before going forward. That's how we can decide the product we want. I'm using Minecarts to phase out rows of redstone blocks, so they are currently not affecting the hoppers. If we disable the carts, then all of the blocks will appear, and now yes, all of the hoppers are locked. Once the composters reach 8 charges, it will simply not allow any more bark into them. That means that the bark will just move forward and fall into the next chute. I thought it was a rather clever way of deciding the output in such a tiny space. The only caveat about this farm is that it obviously uses a lot of axes, so we are going to have to craft and enchant them all. And that also means that we need a repairing loop for all of them. I don't think with the current setup we can make a repairing loop without adding a ton of chutes and stuff going upwards. Or to be honest, either using Tom's storage to fix it or simply leaving more space between each module to add the loops. But I sadly don't have the time to do all of that, so this will have to do for the test. What I'm curious now is to know which one of these is going to be the highest producing farm. But regardless of the results, I might very well go for this one, just because it's a cool farm, and it gives the second product that we need already. But before we go into the results, I did somewhat fix this farm. I just added extra composter so it can handle the full load. I also added some more chute to extract items from the cart. This farm still has many problems and inefficiencies to fix, but this way, it can at least participate with the rest. I'm honestly curious to see the rates of it. So now yes, let's run all of them for 10 minutes and see what numbers we get.
10 minutes later.
Some interesting numbers for sure. I more or less expected the order, but some stuff surprised me. In dead last place we have the chicken farm. It managed to produce the grand amount of 1 bone meal every 3 years maybe, for if there is a leap year. Quite a feat that hardly compensates for the loud and endless poco and the constant lag. In 5th place, we sadly have the worm farm with a total of 216 bone meal, which equates to 1,296 per hour. I honestly had hopes for the worm farm. I even thought it could be improved with fortune shovels and making it somewhat bigger. But the number is so low. Even multiplied by 4, it's still a sad number. In a solid 4th place, we have the fishing farm with 907 bone meal, which means 5,441 per hour. This one was somewhat expected. I assumed it wasn't going to be super high, but still a really solid number, given how many other things we can get from fishing. In 3rd place, we have the bark farm, with an impressive amount of 1,657. That equates to 9,942 per hour, very shy of that 10,000 mark. A really solid performance by the bark farm, and this one it still has the purpose that we do need 4 bark for every 2 bone meal we produce, so it really is a solid contender. On an expected 2nd place, we obviously have the basic create farm. It took a moment to ramp up, but it managed to produce 2,487 bone meal, which means an impressive amount of 14,922 bone meal per hour. For a farm that can so easily be doubled or tripled in efficiency, with just adding a few more basins, it's honestly as good as I was expecting it to be. And finally, to surprise of no one, or at least not to my surprise, the Crazy Warp Tree farm on steroids made 3,535 bone meal, for a grand total of 21,210 bone meal per hour. To be honest, for a farm that is missing most of its efficiency on a bad design on my end, it's mind-blowing it managed to outperform Create by nearly a 50%. More like 45 or whatever. I'm a bat, I'm known for spreading diseases, not for doing math. But here we have it, our winner of today, the best bone meal farm according to the worst scientific experiment and completely unbalanced test. I'm 100% going to make a standalone video for a proper version of this farm. And also, I will have to decide which one of them I want in my world. Or maybe leave a comment on which one you think I should make. But please, don't vote for the chicken farm. It's so awful. Please.